The sun was setting over Elmwood, casting long shadows across the worn-out streets of the struggling neighborhood. Dim streetlights flickered on, barely illuminating the cracked pavement. A woman walked briskly, her old jacket barely covering the pronounced curve of her baby bump. This was Aisha Johnson. Her movements were hurried, her posture tense, and her eyes darted nervously, like someone trying to outrun fate itself. Clutched tightly in her hand was a small, overstuffed bag. Inside were modest items: a can of baby formula, a loaf of bread, and a cheap box of medicine. None of it was worth much, but to Aisha, they represented hope, the only chance to get through another day. She knew stealing was wrong, but desperation leaves little room for moral clarity. "Stop right there," a stern voice called out behind her. Aisha froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Turning slowly, she came face to face with Officer Mark Thompson, a man infamous in the community for his no-nonsense attitude and rigid adherence to the rules. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Aisha Johnson," he said firmly, his voice heavy with authority. "What do you think you're doing?" Aisha stepped back, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, I just needed to help my baby. I swear I'll pay it back," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Thompson's expression remained cold. "Rules are rules," he said, advancing toward her. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring anxiously as they watched the scene unfold. Aisha was led toward the patrol car, her protests growing louder. "Please, I'm pregnant," she cried, desperation spilling into every word. But life doesn't always leave room for compassion. In a split second, tension exploded. A struggle ensued. A shout rang out, followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. Aisha collapsed onto the pavement. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off wide-eyed faces. Elmwood had never witnessed a night like this before. Elmwood was a neighborhood where dreams often withered before they could bloom. The streets, lined with crumbling brick buildings and graffiti-covered walls, whispered tales of hardship and resilience. For Aisha Johnson, this was home, a place where opportunity was scarce, but survival was the only constant. Aisha's life had been a relentless battle against the odds. Growing up in Elmwood, she had watched her parents struggle to keep the family afloat. Her father worked double shifts at the factory, while her mother juggled cleaning jobs. But even their combined efforts could barely cover the bills. The cycle of poverty seemed unbreakable. Yet Aisha harbored dreams of a better life, a life she wanted desperately for her unborn child. At 28, Aisha found herself navigating the same struggles her parents had faced, but now with the added weight of impending motherhood. Her days were spent applying for jobs that never called back, and her nights were sleepless, filled with worry about how she would provide for her baby. The rent was overdue, the fridge was nearly empty, and the baby's due date loomed closer with each passing day. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Aisha had tried to escape Elmwood's grasp, enrolling in community college with hopes of becoming a nurse. But life had other plans. Her mother's sudden illness forced her to drop out and take on caregiving duties. By the time her mother passed away, Aisha was buried under medical debt and had to give up on her education. Now, standing in the dim light of her small apartment, Aisha stared at the eviction notice on the table. The landlord had been patient, but time was running out. She glanced at the empty crib she had managed to buy secondhand, a stark reminder of her growing responsibilities. Desperation had driven her to the store that night. She didn't want to steal, but the idea of her baby going hungry was unbearable. Each item she took, a can of baby formula, a loaf of bread, and a box of prenatal vitamins, was a lifeline for her unborn child. Elmwood's residents understood these struggles all too well. People like Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman next door, often shared what little they had. "We take care of our own," Mrs. Jenkins would say, handing Aisha a warm meal when she could. But goodwill alone couldn't erase the systemic issues that plagued the community: poor infrastructure, limited job opportunities, and a police force known more for its heavy-handed tactics than its protection. Aisha wasn't alone in her despair, but she felt the weight of her decisions keenly. She had always been proud, reluctant to ask for help. But the weight of impending motherhood left her no choice but to take risks she'd never imagined. That night, as she left the store with the stolen items hidden in her bag, her heart pounded with fear and shame. She told herself it was for her child, that it would be the last time. But fate had other plans, and the path she was about to walk would forever change her life. In Elmwoods, in ways she could never have foreseen. The air was heavy with tension as Aisha stepped out of the store. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting shadows on the cracked pavement. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bag, the weight of its contents as much psychological as physical. She hadn't even made it halfway down the block when she heard the sharp bark of a voice behind her. Aisha Johnson, stop right there. She froze, her pulse racing. Turning slowly, she saw Officer Mark Thompson approaching. He was a tall, imposing figure, his badge catching the dim light. Thompson was known in Elmwood not for his kindness, but for his rigid adherence to the rules and his unyielding demeanor. His presence often left the community more anxious than reassured. Aisha's instincts screamed at her to run. But where could she go? Pregnant and already exhausted. She knew she wouldn't get far. Instead, she raised her hands slightly, her voice quivering. Officer, please. I didn't mean to. I'll pay it back. Ma'am. Thompson interrupted, his tone sharp and devoid of empathy. You've been caught shoplifting. Put the bag down and come with me. Tears welled in Aisha's eyes as she tried to explain. I'm pregnant. I have nothing at home. I was just trying to. Enough, Thompson said, cutting her off again. He reached for her arm, and Aisha instinctively pulled away. Please, don't, she pleaded, her voice breaking. A small crowd began to gather. Drawn by the commotion, murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Ma'am, don't make this harder than it has to be, Thompson said, his grip tightening as he tried to lead her toward the patrol car. Aisha struggled, panic overtaking her. The thought of being arrested, of her unborn child growing up without her, consumed her. You don't understand. Please, she cried, her voice rising in desperation. The situation escalated rapidly. Aisha's resistance, though minimal, seemed to frustrate Thompson. His tone grew harsher, his actions more forceful. The onlookers' murmurs turned into shouts. She's pregnant, someone yelled. Take it easy. Then, in the chaos of the moment, everything fell apart. Aisha stumbled, and Thompson, reaching for his weapon, perhaps out of instinct or panic, fired a single shot. The sound echoed through the street, silencing the crowd. Aisha crumpled to the ground, her hands clutching her stomach. Gasps and screams erupted as bystanders rushed forward, their phones still recording. Oh my God, he shot her, someone screamed. Thompson stood frozen, his gun still in his hand, as if trying to process what had just happened. Aisha lay motionless, her breath shallow, blood pooling beneath her. The bag of stolen items spilled onto the ground, its contents stark reminders of her desperation. A can of formula, a loaf of bread, a box of vitamins. The crowd erupted in anger, their voices a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. She was pregnant. Why did you shoot her? Call an ambulance. Minutes felt like hours as paramedics arrived. Their stretcher hurriedly wheeled toward Aisha. The sight of her limp body being lifted sent a wave of anguish through the crowd. Officer Thompson tried to explain himself, but his words were drowned out by the shouts of the community. There was no threat. This is murder. By the time the ambulance sped away, Elmwood was a powder keg on the verge of explosion. News of the incident spread like wildfire, amplified by the videos circulating on social media. For the residents of Elmwood, this wasn't just another tragic encounter. It was a breaking point. Aisha's death became a rallying cry for justice, her story resonating far beyond the borders of the neighborhood. And for Officer Thompson, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. The news of Aisha's tragic death reached Jamal Johnson late one evening. He sat in his sleek, modern office, the hum of servers in the background. On his desk lay awards and framed photos of tech conferences where he'd been a keynote speaker. But none of that mattered as he stared at his phone, his hands trembling. The video was hard to watch, the cries of the crowd, the chaos, and his mother's final moments. Jamal hadn't seen his mother in years. Life had pulled them in different directions. After leaving Elmwood to pursue his dreams, he'd poured himself into building a successful business, creating technology that connected people around the world. But now, he felt disconnected from his roots, from his family, and most painfully, from the woman who had sacrificed so much for him. The next morning, Jamal was on a plane back to Elmwood. The streets he once called home looked smaller, worn down, yet they were alive with people mourning, organizing, and demanding answers. His mother's name was on their lips, her image on their signs. Jamal made his way to the local church where a community meeting was being held. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with grief and resolve. Elderly women held hands in prayer, while younger activists discussed plans to hold those responsible accountable. At the center of it all was Mrs. Jenkins, his mother's neighbor and longtime friend. "Jamal," she said, her voice breaking as she hugged him tightly. "Your mama always spoke so proudly of you. She knew you'd make a difference." Her words were both comforting and a call to action. Jamal stood before the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside him. "My mother deserved better. Your families deserve better. And I'm here to make sure her story leads to real change." His determination ignited something in the room. Jamal didn't just want justice for his mother. He wanted to address the broader issues plaguing the community. Over the next few days, he met with witnesses, watched hours of video footage, and combed through public records. He began to uncover a pattern of misconduct within the local system, stories of others whose voices had been silenced. Jamal wasn't alone in his quest. He partnered with Maria Lopez, a seasoned journalist known for her investigative work. Together, they pieced together a timeline of events and uncovered discrepancies in the official reports. Videos showed actions that didn't align with the statements given, raising serious questions about accountability. As the evidence grew, so did the movement. Social media became their megaphone, amplifying Aisha's story and the broader call for change. Jamal used his resources to fund legal experts and support grassroots efforts. His connections brought in national attention, turning Elmwood's struggle into a focal point for a larger conversation. Late one night, Jamal sat in his mother's old living room, now filled with boxes of evidence and plans. He held a small photograph of her, taken on his high school graduation day. Her smile was radiant, her eyes filled with pride. "You gave me everything you could," he whispered. "Now it's my turn." The next morning, Jamal and Maria delivered their findings to the local authorities and shared them with the press. The pressure was mounting, and those who had been complicit could no longer hide behind closed doors. For Jamal, this was about more than justice. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the loss he had. His journey was far from over, but his resolve had never been stronger. The days following Aisha's tragic death were a whirlwind of grief and determination. Elmwood, a neighborhood often overlooked and underestimated, became the epicenter of a movement. People who once passed each other on the street with little more than a nod were now coming together, bound by a shared loss and a collective purpose. Mrs. Jenkins, Aisha's elderly neighbor, became one of the movement's anchors. Known for her kindness and determination, she organized a food drive for struggling families, a gesture that resonated deeply. "We have to take care of each other," she said as she handed out bags of groceries. Her words carried weight. They were not just about food, but about survival and solidarity. The local church transformed into a hub for action. Vigils were held nightly, where residents shared their stories, lit candles, and prayed for justice. Pastor Williams, a longtime community leader, urged the people of Elmwood to channel their pain into purpose. Aisha's life mattered, he declared during one emotional sermon. Her death must spark a change that reaches beyond these streets. Jamal, still reeling from his mother's loss, found himself drawn to the church. During a vigil, he stood silently at the back, listening to the voices of those his mother had known so well. One by one, they spoke of her generosity, her resilience, and her unwavering hope despite the hardships she faced. It was a side of his mother he hadn't fully understood until now. Moved by their words, Jamal addressed the gathering. "This community was my mother's heart and soul," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "If we want change, we have to fight for it together. We deserve a system that protects us, not one that tears us apart." His words galvanized the crowd. Elmwood's residents began to organize in ways they hadn't before. Activists held workshops on knowing your rights. Mothers formed support groups for their children. And local artists painted murals to honor Aisha and other victims of systemic failings. One particularly striking mural showed Aisha with her arms outstretched, holding her unborn child, surrounded by doves and the words, "Her voice lives on." Jamal used his resources to amplify their efforts. He funded legal aid for families who had faced similar tragedies and partnered with national organizations to bring attention to Elmwood's struggles. Together with journalist Maria Lopez, he uncovered years of systemic issues within the local police department. From falsified reports to unchecked misconduct, social media became a powerful tool for the movement. Stories of Aisha's life and the injustice she faced spread far and wide, sparking outrage and support. The hashtag Justice for Aisha trended nationally, drawing attention from high-profile figures who pledged their support. As the movement gained traction, Elmwood streets filled with peaceful marches. Signs reading "Enough is enough" and "We deserve justice" were held high, while chants echoed through the air. Jamal marched at the front, holding hands with Mrs. Jenkins and Pastor Williams. The sight of such unity brought hope to a community long accustomed to despair. Behind the scenes, Jamal and Maria worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum didn't fade. They held town halls to keep residents informed and encouraged them to share their stories. "Every voice matters," Jamal often said. "Together, we're unstoppable." The movement began to yield results. Local officials, once silent, were forced to address the community's demands. Investigations were launched, and long-buried truths began to surface. Elmwood's residents felt the weight of their efforts paying off, though they knew the fight was far from over. One evening, as Jamal stood in front of the mural honoring his mother, Mrs. Jenkins joined him. "You've brought this community together," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "Your mama would be so proud." Jamal nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "She taught me to never give up," he replied. "Now it's our turn to make sure her legacy changes lives." Elmwood wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a beacon of resilience and hope. Together, they were proving that even in the face of tragedy, unity could spark a transformation. And this was only the beginning. Months of mourning and mobilizing transformed Elmwood from a quiet, overlooked neighborhood into a battleground for justice. As the movement gained traction, Jamal Johnson became its most prominent figurehead, not by choice but by necessity. With the memory of his mother fueling his determination, Jamal threw himself into dismantling the system that had failed her, and countless others like her. The first step was uncovering the truth about what had happened the night Aisha's life was cut short. Working alongside journalist Maria Lopez, Jamal sifted through police reports, witness testimonies, and security footage from the scene. What they uncovered was damning. Officer Mark Thompson had a record of complaints for excessive force, but these had been consistently buried under bureaucracy. Elmwood's police department was rife with unchecked power, with many officers operating under a culture of silence and impunity. Maria, known for her fearless reporting, published a series of exposés that detailed the systemic issues within the department. Each article painted a clearer picture of corruption, falsified evidence, dismissed complaints, and a lack of accountability that had allowed officers like Thompson to act without fear of repercussions. The community was outraged, but their anger was channeled into action rather than despair. Jamal knew that raising awareness wasn't enough. Systemic change required systemic pressure. With his resources and platform, he hired a team of high-profile lawyers to build a case against the department. The legal team's strategy was twofold: hold Thompson accountable for his actions and expose the broader issues that allowed such tragedies to occur. Meanwhile, protests continued to grow. Elmwood streets, once desolate and quiet, were now filled with people demanding justice. Signs bearing messages like "Justice for Aisha" and "End police corruption" were a common sight. Music, speeches, and poetry became integral parts of the demonstrations, as the community expressed its pain and resilience through art. Behind closed doors, Jamal worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. He met with local leaders, activists, and even lawmakers who had begun to take notice of the movement. Each meeting was an opportunity to push for real, lasting reforms. "This isn't just about one officer," Jamal often said. "It's about fixing a system that's been broken for far too long." As public pressure mounted, the city was forced to act. An independent investigation into the Elmwood Police Department was launched, led by an external oversight committee. While this was a victory, Jamal knew it wasn't the end goal. Accountability without meaningful reform would only be a bandage on a deeper wound. The investigation uncovered years of misconduct and systemic failures, evidence of racial profiling, excessive force, and cover-ups painted a grim picture of the department's culture. As these findings became public, the protests grew even louder. Elmwood wasn't just demanding justice for Aisha anymore. It was demanding justice for everyone who had suffered under a flawed system. One pivotal moment came during a televised town hall, where Jamal and Maria faced off against the police chief and the mayor. Jamal, calm but resolute, laid out the evidence with precision. "We're not here to destroy the police," he said. "We're here to rebuild a system that serves and protects everyone equally. Accountability isn't an attack, it's a foundation for trust." The crowd erupted in applause, and the pressure on local officials became impossible to ignore. Policy proposals began to emerge: body cameras for all officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board to hold the department accountable. But the most critical battle was yet to come: the trial of Officer Mark Thompson. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and Elmwood residents, all waiting to see if justice would finally be served. Jamal sat in the front row, flanked by his legal team and community leaders. The prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by video footage that contradicted Thompson's initial report. Witnesses testified about Aisha's desperate pleas for mercy, painting a picture of a woman who had been treated not with humanity, but with cold indifference. The defense argued that Thompson had acted in the heat of the moment, claiming his actions were a result of poor judgment rather than malice. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the excuses. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and tears. Justice, though long overdue, had finally arrived. Thompson was held accountable, and the message was clear: no one is above the law. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict. When news of the guilty verdict spread, cheers erupted, and chants of "Justice for Aisha" filled the air. Jamal stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's a step forward. My mother's life mattered, and so does every life in this community. We've shown that when we stand together, we can create change. But the fight doesn't stop here." True to his word, Jamal continued to push for systemic reforms. With the support of Elmwood's residents, he launched the Aisha Johnson Foundation, dedicated to advocating for police accountability and supporting families affected by injustice. Elmwood, once a forgotten neighborhood, had become a symbol of resilience and transformation. Its people had faced unimaginable pain, but they had turned that pain into power, proving that even the smallest voices can create echoes that change the world. And while the scars of the past would never fully heal, they served as a reminder of what had been achieved and what was still worth fighting for. Months of protests, investigations, and relentless advocacy culminated in the trial of Officer Mark Thompson. The case had drawn national attention, turning Elmwood's courthouse into the epicenter of a movement for justice. The small town streets, once quiet and forgotten, were now filled with media vans, activists, and supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Aisha" and "Reform Now." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Jamal Johnson sat in the front row, his face a mask of composure despite the emotional weight of the proceedings. Beside him were Maria Lopez, his legal team, and members of the community who had stood by him since the beginning. Each day of the trial felt like a battle, with testimonies, evidence, and arguments revealing the depth of the injustice Aisha and others had endured. The prosecution presented a damning case against Thompson. Video footage, eyewitness accounts, and inconsistencies in his official report painted a picture of negligence and excessive force. Witness after witness took the stand, sharing harrowing stories of a police department that had long ignored accountability. The defense argued that Thompson had acted in self-defense and cited the chaotic nature of the encounter as justification. But the jury could see through the thinly veiled excuses. One moment stood out as the emotional crux of the trial, the playback of Aisha's final moments captured on a bystander's phone. The courtroom fell silent as the video showed her pleading, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, please. Don't." The sound of the gunshot that followed sent shivers through the room. For many, it was the moment the gravity of the tragedy became undeniable. As the trial drew to a close, Jamal was given the opportunity to deliver a statement. He stood tall, his voice unwavering as he addressed the court. "My mother's life was not disposable. She was a human being, a mother, and a member of this community. Her death is not just a tragedy. It's a reflection of a broken system that fails to protect the people it's meant to serve. This trial isn't just about her. It's about every life lost, every voice silenced, and every family torn apart by injustice. We demand accountability because without it, there can be no trust, no safety, and no justice." When the jury returned with the verdict, the courtroom held its collective breath, guilty on all counts. The words reverberated through the room, triggering a wave of emotion. Tears flowed freely, and the crowd outside erupted in cheers as news of the verdict spread. Justice, though long overdue, had finally been served. The verdict marked a pivotal moment for Elmwood and beyond. Officer Mark Thompson's conviction sent a clear message. No one is above the law. But for Jamal and the community, it was just the beginning of a larger fight. Jamal's focus shifted toward ensuring that the lessons learned from Aisha's tragedy led to meaningful change. He established the Aisha Johnson Foundation, an organization dedicated to advocating for police reform, supporting victims of systemic injustice, and providing resources for single mothers in underserved communities. The foundation quickly gained national attention, becoming a beacon of hope for those seeking accountability and reform. Elmwood itself became a symbol of resilience and transformation. Community leaders worked tirelessly to implement reforms within the local police department. Under public pressure, the city enacted policies that included mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board. These changes, though significant, were just the first steps toward rebuilding trust between the police and the community. Jamal continued to use his platform to amplify stories like his mother's. At a national summit on justice reform, he delivered a powerful keynote speech. "Behind every name, every statistic, is a human being with dreams, hopes, and loved ones. My mother's life mattered, and so does every life. We have a responsibility to ensure that no one else has to endure what my family and my community have endured." The impact of Jamal's advocacy extended far beyond Elmwood. His work inspired similar movements across the country, uniting people in the fight for equity and justice. The Aisha Johnson Foundation partnered with other organizations to push for federal legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. Back in Elmwood, the community's spirit remained strong. Neighborhood initiatives flourished, from mentorship programs for at-risk youth to workshops on civic engagement and empowerment. The local church, which had once been a gathering place for vigils, became a hub for organizing and education. Mrs. Jenkins, Aisha's elderly neighbor, summed it up best: "We've been through the storm, but now we're planting seeds for a brighter future." For Jamal, the journey was deeply personal. Each victory brought a sense of closure, but the pain of losing his mother remained. On the anniversary of her death, he visited her grave, placing a bouquet of lilies, her favorite flower, and promising to continue the fight. "Your story didn't end here," he whispered. "It's just the beginning." As the sun set on Elmwood that evening, it cast a warm glow over the town that had once been defined by struggle. Now, it stood as a testament to the power of unity, resilience, and the unwavering belief that change is possible. Aisha's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the transformative movement her story had inspired. And while the road ahead remained long, one thing was certain: Elmwood would never be the same, and neither would the world.